Hello, welcome to part 2 of my lecture on chapter 14, Epidemiology. We left off in part 1 where we were talking about different conditions, disease conditions related to the extent of host involvement. And so I'm going to pick back up with toxemia, which refers to the condition of having toxins in the blood. Viremia refers to having viruses in the blood. A primary infection is an acute infection that is what causes the initial illness. A secondary infection is an infection that happens after a primary infection causes the host to be predisposed to other infections. So it's an opportunistic infection. A subclinical disease is where you have an infection, but there are no signs or symptoms that can be observed. So next we're going to talk about patterns of disease, and we're going to look at predisposing factors for diseases, and we're going to talk about the development and decline processes for how diseases progress. Okay, so things that make the body more susceptible to disease are called predisposing factors, and there are a lot of things that can cause someone to be more susceptible to disease, like gender, which we talked about a lot in your student PowerPoint presentations, inherited traits like the sickle cell gene, and other things that are passed on from one generation to the next. Also, the climate and the weather, fatigue, age, lifestyle, nutrition, and chemotherapy, as well as other environmental factors. So the way that diseases develop, they have different stages. And so the first stage is called the incubation period. And that is the time between when the person is initially exposed to or infected with the microorganism and when the first signs and symptoms begin to appear. The prodromal period is right after incubation, and that is when the symptoms are mild. It's just the early mild symptoms. Then there's the period of illness, during which time the symptoms of the disease are the most severe. And then there's the period of decline, where the signs and symptoms begin to become less severe. And then finally you have the period of convalescence, where the body returns to its prediseased state, but maybe you're still feeling kind of a little bit weak and you're not 100% again, but it's that time period where you start to feel like a human again. And so this is a graph from your book that shows the stages of a disease and relates them to the number of microbes present. And so you can look at that. Now we're going to talk about how diseases spread. And we'll talk about reservoirs for infection, where you can find sources of infections and the different ones. And we'll also talk about disease transmission. So a reservoir of infection is somewhere where the microbes or microorganisms that cause disease are stored, or it's a source of those microbes. So you have human reservoirs, which a lot of people are carriers for different microorganisms, but don't have obvious infections, or the diseases may be latent. You also have animal reservoirs, which are called zoonoses. Like zoology is the study of animals. A zoonose is an animal reservoir. And so those are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. And then you also have non-living sources of diseases, such as water and soil. And when we did our student disease PowerPoints, there were several diseases that you can get from soil, such as tetanus, and water, such as cholera. And so different ways of transmitting diseases is what we're going to talk about next. So you have contact transmission, which is where So you can have direct contact transmission, which requires very close association between someone who has the disease and a potential host. There's also indirect contact transmission, which is a microorganism that can spread to a new host from a non-living object. And a non-living object that can pass on a microbe is called a fomite. And then you have droplet transmission, which is the transmission of microorganisms through airborne droplets. And usually those can be transmitted a meter or less away. And these are pictures from your book showing an example of each of the types of contact transmission. So vehicle transmission is where you have the transmission of a disease from an inanimate or non-living reservoir. And there are waterborne, foodborne, and airborne methods of vehicle transmission. And we talked about each of those during the student PowerPoint presentations. Okay, and vectors are other living organisms, usually arthropods like fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes, that transmit diseases. And there are two main methods for that, mechanical transmission and biological transmission. In mechanical transmission, the arthropod carries the pathogen on its feet. And in biological transmission, the pathogen has part of its life cycle in the vector organism or in the arthropod. And that microorganism is usually transmitted to the host by through a bite or through the feces. This is an example of mechanical transmission. Flies carry a lot of microorganisms on their feet, and so when they land on your food, that's a potential way for you to become infected by one of those microorganisms. And I'm sure that many of you in this class are familiar with healthcare associated infections, or HAIs, and those are infections that are associated with being transmitted in a hospital or other healthcare setting. And we're going to also talk about compromised hosts with this section. So HAIs are diseases that are acquired in a healthcare facility. Another word for HAIs is nosocomial infections. And about 1 in 25 hospital patients are affected by nosocomial infections. 2 million people per year are infected, and there are around 20,000 deaths per year caused by HAIs. Okay, so the reason that you have HAIs is you have microorganisms in the hospital environment. A lot of times people who are in a healthcare facility have a weakened immune system. And then also the chain of transmission in a hospital can lead to these infections if you don't have proper methods for cleaning and sterilizing. So a compromised host is just a person who has a lowered resistance to infection by microorganisms because of disease or chemotherapy or radiation therapy, or burn victims are very common individuals who have compromised immune systems, and because the skin is very important for keeping microorganisms out of our bodies. So let's see, these are just examples. In your book there's a table that has all of these different microbes, and they are often involved in HAIs. And so you have Staph aureus, which is common in surgical wounds, Clostridium, Enterococcus species, Candida, E. coli, Pseudomonas, which is very hard to kill, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, and and more. And so the way that HAIs can be controlled or dealt with is by reducing the number of pathogens. And things that you can do to lower the number of pathogens is frequent hand washing. Make sure to disinfect bathing tubs that they're used for patients. Obviously cleaning instruments scrupulously or using disposable instruments. And then a lot of instruments are autoclaved and they have other methods for sterilizing those. And then also using disposable bandages and tubing. And then for a lot of healthcare organizations, they have infection control committees that come up with procedures to ensure that these types of infections are minimized in their healthcare facilities. So, emerging infectious diseases are diseases that are either new or for some reason are increasing in incidence or show the potential to increase in incidence sometime soon. Most of them are zoonoses, most of them are viruses, and most of them are vector-borne. So things that lead to emerging infectious diseases are genetic recombination or genetic changes in these bacterial and viral species, evolution of new strains, so the evolution of bacterial and viral organisms, for lack of a better term for viruses, the widespread use of antibiotics and pesticides, which can lead to the development of antibiotic resistant strains like MRSA, which everyone is familiar with, methicillin resistant Staph aureus, which is a problem in a lot of healthcare facilities. And then changing weather patterns can make it to where certain diseases that were restricted geographically because of climate, those diseases can be successful in other locations as the climates change and become more suitable to them. So, other things that contribute to emerging infectious diseases are modern transportation, so travel, people traveling to places where we didn't used to travel that much. You have people going back and forth all over the world and moving these microbes around so that they become problems in other locations geographically where they weren't before. Also, ecological disaster, war, expanding human settlement or development. Also, animal control measures, public health failure, and we had talked about diphtheria and cholera and some of those other waterborne diseases being a problem in places where you don't have good sewage or sanitation systems. Okay, so going back to epidemiology, it's the study of where and when diseases occur and how they are transmitted in populations or how they spread in populations. Epidemiologists determine the cause of a disease. They also look at other important factors that affect how diseases spread. They develop methods to control diseases, and they also put together data and graphs to help improve the understanding of how diseases spread and can be controlled. Several famous epidemiologists from the past are here. John Snow mapped the occurrence of cholera in London. Semmelweis showed that hand washing decreased the spread of puerperal sepsis in OB facilities. And Florence Nightingale showed that improving sanitation would lower the incidence of typhoid fever. So there are different sub-branches of epidemiology, which I'll let you read about in your book. And I wanted to tell you about the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the federal body that publishes the MMWR and looks at morbidity and mortality rates for different diseases, and also publishes a list of notifiable infectious diseases, which are diseases where physicians are required to report the occurrence to the CDC. And that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much.